With Resident Evil Village just around the corner, it got me thinking about another Resident Evil game with villages in it. And oh yes, I'm talking about that one. It's one of the most influential games ever made. It innovated the third-person action genre. It reinvented survival horror as we know it. And above all else, it's been ported 11 times. I would know because I've bought it 4 times. Make it 5. And see, it's kind of absurd to think that I've purchased it that many times, not just because I have a problem, but because it was only supposed to belong on one console in the first place, the GameCube. However, there's a piece to this whole thing I didn't remember. I was talking to my co-producer Chris Morris, and I was like, isn't it crazy that Resident Evil 4 is a GameCube exclusive? And he was like, yeah, it was a part of the Capcom Five. And I was like, what? It was this deal Capcom had with Nintendo to make exclusive games for the GameCube, and Capcom just stabbed them in the back. I was intrigued. So first, what is the Capcom Five? 18 years ago, 3 years before Resi even graced this planet, in 2002, Capcom announced this big old partnership with Nintendo deemed the Capcom Five. The press release read, new 5 titles for Nintendo GameCube. Piano 3, Beautiful Joe, Dead Phoenix, Killer 7, and, lastly, Resident Evil 4. Now, with the exception of Resident Evil 4, all of these other titles were completely new IPs, and their development would be overseen by Shinji Mikami, who is basically like Mr. Resident Evil Man. He's a big deal. In fact, this whole thing was a huge deal. We're talking one of the biggest companies in gaming, with one of its biggest names, Shinji Mikami, making 5 games, 4 of which were completely new, exclusively for the GameCube. Nintendo fans were excited, like this dude, Chris Scullion, writer of both the Nintendo and Super Nintendo Encyclopedia.
As a big kind of GameCube fan, at that point I was already starting to get quite concerned and frustrated that third parties weren't supporting Nintendo. I mean, I was used to it because Nintendo 64 went through the same thing. So when the Capcom 5 were announced, my initial thought was, yay, fine. I mean, obviously, not only was Nintendo getting 5 brand new games, the GameCube was also getting like 5 what could potentially be fantastic exclusives. The GameCube was going to have more stuff that was kind of exclusive to it and gave it its own kind of little character and its own personality.
For any console, not just the GameCube, this would have been a big deal, but it was especially so for the GameCube. First, it was not selling well. Now, despite being a more powerful system than the PS2, its power wasn't enough to make up for the fact that it was not a multimedia device. It could not play CDs or DVDs like the PS2 or Xbox. 2, it did not have great third-party support. Aside from Nintendo's usual suspects, there wasn't a whole lot of support or exclusives for the GameCube. And though its flagship franchises were enough to keep it afloat, there wasn't much support to attract a broader audience. Or, to be really specific, it didn't have guns, blood, or butts. Now, it's not scientifically proven, but from what I hear, it could remedy success, according to me. Anyways, as it would churn out, the Capcom 5 had all of it. If Capcom could produce 5 very good games that appealed to a broader market than just Mario and Zelda lovers, it would do 2 major things for Nintendo. Push console sales up and show third-party developers that abandoned Nintendo during the N64 that it was cool to work with them again because they were down with guns, blood, and butts. And all the meanwhile, Capcom would just ride the wave of success. However, there was a minor communication error. So the US press release alluded that all of the games would be GameCube exclusives, but the Japanese press release said otherwise. As it turns out, Capcom would be developing these 5 games first and foremost for the GameCube, with the possibility of them being ported in the future. But that's okay, because the most anticipated one of them all was absolutely 100% definitely going to be a GameCube exclusive. There was even a limited edition GameCube just for it. Look at this, look. Ooh, there it is. It was no different than any other GameCube, and you're damn right I wanted it. So one by one, the Capcom 5 came out as promised, with the first one being in the butts category, Piano 3, which apparently folks weren't too crazy about. More like Piano 3 out of 10. It's not my joke. Co-producer Chris gave it to me. Thanks, Chris. Then there was Dead Phoenix, which just was straight up canceled. Never came out, living right up to its name. But Beautiful Joe did come out, and it was great, and had some success on the GameCube until it was ported to the PS2. And in that moment, it seemed pretty clear that Capcom was losing faith in the very plan that it set forth on. But there was still Resident Evil 4, the chosen one, the one sworn to exclusivity for the GameCube. Director Shinji Mikami himself said he would cut off his own head before it was ported to other consoles. And so GameCube fanatics held onto it. It was the cover story for several Nintendo publications. Previews were praising it. It was easily the most anticipated game of 2005. And to top it off, it was the most un-Nintendo game possible. It was super violent, hyper detailed, and had its own blood-splattered controller to prove it. It even had its own website, ResidentEvilController.com. And then, 2 months before the game came out, Capcom sent this press release, which read, Capcom's million-selling series, Resident Evil, expanding to the Nintendo GameCube and the Sony PlayStation 2.
There was a few years into the GameCube's life at this point, people were thinking this isn't going well. But at least we were clinging to the fact that don't worry, this game looks great, and we're going to have a great game. Just as the GameCube is kind of flatline, and we've got this great one, and we'll always have that. We can cling to that. And then obviously a couple of months before it came out, Capcom said, "Nah, we can't let that happen. This is coming to. We're not even giving you that. It's coming to PlayStation 2 purely in terms of financial reasons." They had to kind of expand and say, "Okay, sorry, we know we promised these were exclusives, but now they're coming to PlayStation 2 as well because." Money. we've got to sell these things, and we've got to make sure more people can see them.
GameCube fanatics were, well, less than thrilled. So much so that they sent letters in to magazines at the time, but because that was back in the day before people just flooded comment sections. Now, for what it's worth, the Nintendo GameCube did have exclusivity on the game for most of 2005 until it came out on the PS2 towards the end of the year. And as history has told, it's been regaled as one of the greatest video games of all time, being ported from everything to the Nokia phone to the Zeebo, selling over 10 million copies across the 67 some platforms it's been ported to. And Shinji Mikami is still alive and well. He never cut his head off. He just left Capcom instead and formed Platinum Games. Nintendo, on the other hand, well, some speculate that it left them bitter, jaded, stabbed in the back. That was their hope to bring life to the console. It's even circulated that this is all the very reason in which Mega Man and Street Fighter characters were not in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, a game that featured third-party characters like Snake from Metal Gear Solid. Strangely, though, is that most people that worked on the Capcom Five eventually found their way back to being Nintendo exclusive developers. Like Suda51, who directed Killer 7, is now making No More Heroes 3 exclusively for the Nintendo Switch. Then there's Platinum Games, which a lot of the people who work at that studio worked on Beautiful Joe, are now developing Bayonetta 3 as Nintendo Switch exclusive. So all the roads somehow led back.
I can understand how Nintendo would have been annoyed at third parties for not supporting the GameCube that much, but I also don't really feel like they had much say in the matter. It's not as if companies were suddenly saying, actually, we'd like to make GameCube games now, and Nintendo were saying, no, you had your chance. I wonder how much of it is a case of Nintendo genuinely having a grievance against these companies, or whether it was just a case of them being hurt and not being able to do much about it because until their systems were popular, they weren't really going to have much interest anyway. And Capcom seems to have kind of repaired relationships a bit now that Ryu and Ken and Mega Man are on Smash Brothers, and there's more Monster Hunter games coming next year on the Switch. It looks like things have finally been patched up, and that gives me a warm feeling in my tummy.
Now, it's kind of impossible to think what would have happened if Resident Evil remained a Nintendo-only franchise. Would Shinji Mikami still be at Capcom instead of going to start Platinum Games? Would Resident Evil 5 or 6 be multiplayer games? I don't know. But what I do know is that Leon Kennedy would have been invited to fight in the Super Smash Bros. Tournament, and Chris Redfield would have never ended up punching a boulder. And I don't know if I'm willing to give up one for the other. Now, looking back and learning about this whole thing, if there's anything about the Capcom Five's legacy that I find extremely interesting, is that this whole thing was an enormous risk for a company like Capcom to make these games new IPs for what was a fleeting console. So I have to give a tremendous amount of merit to Capcom for at least trying something different, even though it clearly didn't pan out the way they intended. As for Resident Evil 4, I'm sure it would have received the exact same praise if it had come out for anything else, but its legacy is all the more interesting to look back on, knowing that it was supposed to be a Nintendo-only video game. Lastly, it's worth remembering that Capcom did fulfill its promise to some degree, as one of the 5 games is still an exclusive for the GameCube. It's just a matter of whether or not anybody ever wanted it in the first place. Hey, if you made it this far, thanks for watching this episode of Remember When. Now, if you're new here, we made a bunch of other episodes, and you could check out a playlist for those in the description below. Once again, I'm Kurt. Pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to see you again. Let me know if you enjoyed this episode. You could leave a comment. I'll be there commenting back. Okay, from myself and the rest of the team, you're great. Be great. Keep being great. Be the best you can be. I gotta go. Okay, see you later. And had its own blood-splattered controller to prove it. Oh, did I actually kill all those dudes while doing that? Gets me every single time.